Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the November session of Mid-Missouri Civil War Roundtable. Many years ago, I was in a position where I was trying to convince teenagers that learning to do a geometry proof would keep zits away from them. That doesn't have that darn thing to do with Ambrose, Bierce, or anything else we're doing tonight, other than the fact, occasionally when I give a geometry test, I would put a quote at the bottom of the test, the end of the test. And I had a book of quotes to choose from, so I could choose something that's suited my mood that day. And Ambrose Bierce showed up quite frequently in this book of quotes. Well, who the heck is Ambrose Bierce? And all I knew at that time is that he was connected with the Civil War in some manner. So that was my introduction to Ambrose Bierce. And tonight, I'm expecting Evan to tell us more about Ambrose Bierce and what his connection to the Civil War was. So, Evan, it is yours.
All right, thank you. Welcome to Ambrose Bierce and the Civil War. Some of you may know that he did a lot after the Civil War. I will only deal with a little bit of that. He was born in 1842, and most people think that he died in 1914. We'll talk about that later. Brief biography. He came from an anti-slavery family in Ohio. Later, the family lived in places like Warsaw, Indiana, and Walnut Creek, Indiana. He was said to have a lot of nightmares as a kid, and he was somehow aware of the spiritualist movement, which may have affected him in some ways. And he was said to be a sullen teenager. Not that that's so unusual. He enlisted in the 9th Indiana Volunteers. Twice he rescued fallen soldiers. He was wounded at Kennesaw Mountain, Georgia, 1864. He had a brother, Albert, in the Ohio Artillery. He went to what later became West Virginia, went back to Indiana, re-enlisted, and often served as a topographer. You may know him from his latter days when he wrote with Albert in San Francisco. He was an editor of something called the Newsletter, 1871. And he often was known as Bitter Bierce. I think it was Mark Twain that gave him that title for his humor, and we'll see later the way he described war. And he did live in England for a while in the 1870s. He also worked for William Randolph Hearst. Of course, that was after the Civil War in the 1880s. And he wrote Civil War stories, some of which I'll be talking about tonight. And one writer said they're tales of alienation, sardonic wit, and fatalism. He was divorced in 1891, 2 sons who died between 89 and 1901. In 1913, he went to Mexico by way of Louisiana and Texas to another civil war, probably died in the siege of Ojinaga in Mexico in January 1914, but there's still some controversy about that. And at one point he said, "To be a gringo in Mexico, that is euthanasia." That was farewell letters. So what were some of the acts of heroism? Well, he saved a corporal in the midst of battle. He drew maps with the available 19th century technology, especially at Osaka, Georgia. He taught a poet named George Sterling that war should not be glorified, and went on to Mexico. And some of that information comes from the source shown here. Bailey and others, The Conflicts and Compromises of Writer and Civil War Soldier Ambrose Bierce, a document shared by Beverly Shaw, who I hope is watching the YouTube version of this, a Civil War Roundtable of Western Missouri, thanks to her. You may know him from a movie called Old Gringo, which is not a really great one, but Gregory Peck plays Bierce. As the critics pointed out, they don't show much about him as a writer. He holds up volumes of his works and says, "What did I do this for?" Or was this a waste of time, or something like that. He kind of throws it at an audience and goes off to Mexico. One group of critics said it was really not a good movie, and most of it is Jane Fonda walking through the Mexican Revolution. Now, he served under General Hazen, shown here in his Indiana troops, and sometimes appears on magazine covers. Pretty sure that's him. There he is in uniform. I did not look up that issue, though. I found it online. Some of you would know him from an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, which is a real location. I know I saw it as a 12-year-old, 13-year-old or something on Twilight Zone. It was actually from French TV and broadcast on Twilight Zone a couple years later. One of the lines in there is, Peyton Farquhar was dead. His body with a broken neck swung gently from side to side beneath the timbers of the Owl Creek Bridge. And that is a photo from the French film, which actually won some awards, which became a Twilight Zone episode. A couple other pictures from that episode. You see Civil War soldiers, fairly realistic. I remember I watched it a couple times in researching this, and I think they have an 18th century cannon instead of the right type. But that's probably all they had there in France at the time. And of course, there you see Peyton Farquhar by name hanging. There really is an Owl Creek near Shiloh. I also looked up some reviews of the story and the film. Some people think that the characters lack ability to understand or cope with extreme threats. That's one interpretation. Many think that he was influenced by Poe in that kind of dark writing. He was misled by Glory, they say, the protagonist, and physically misled by a disguised Union scout dressed as a Confederate. I don't think they show that very much in the Twilight Zone version. I think it jumps right into the hanging, although there is some of him plunging into the water and having a fantasy that all is well. Towards the end, to cut to the chase, a little spoiler alert, he thinks, in the film version anyway, he thinks he's being approached by his wife from Ambrose, and instead it's the noose on his neck. And that's the end. So a common ground of fantasy and shadowy areas between Ambrose Bierce and the Twilight Zone, which is why I showed it. In some ways, he anticipates Stephen Crane, who praised the story and later wrote Red Badge of Courage. One quote I found in Crane that it's a little bit like Bierce is, he, meaning Henry, I think, strode forth his infantile features black with rage. It does sound a lot like something Bierce might say. It does show the military etiquette of hanging. Later on, another way you may know him is the Devil's Dictionary, which came out in 1911. It was enlarged in the 60s. Patriot, a dupe of statesmen and the tool of conquerors. A lot of that is taken from Kathy Davidson's book and his fictions. He was also a Chickamauga. Some of this actually comes from what Andy Payton shared on on the listserv, an email a few months ago. General Bragg was trying to turn the Union leftward and intervene between the Union and Chattanooga, Tennessee, thwarted by mounted Union Brigade. Union reinforcements found a brigade gone when they arrived. They burned Reed's Bridge, one of two over the West Chickamauga River on day 2. And Generals Rosecrans and Thomas, talk about them a little bit more, fought against Confederate brigades more than they thought from having captured one brigade's man. They underestimated the force. Grant eventually replaced the confused Rosecrans with Thomas, but he himself didn't get along that well with the so-called aristocratic Virginian Thomas, who was also a Mexican War hero. Okay, a picture of Rosecrans, and Bierce said of him, courageous and dutiful, interesting and lovable. His best judgment was never very good. Really crank. And Thomas, General Thomas, replaced Rosecrans. He was often known as Pap, or Old Reliable, many other terms, eventually fortifying Chattanooga, and he was sometimes called the Rock of Chickamauga. Bierce wrote several stories, quite a few, and one of them involved Chickamauga. He also wrote to a general who had been a Confederate on the other side, of course, and sent some errata. This Colonel Gracie had written a book called The Truth About Chickamauga in 1911, not too long before Gracie passed, and not too long before, presumably, Bierce passed. In his story, you have a deaf-mute child, planter's son with a wooden sword. So he talks about the child growing up playing soldier, but you don't find out about the deaf-mute part until later on. So that's another connection with the Twilight Zone kind of thing, where you sometimes have a revelation about something that's a bit morbid. He sees creeping men, battle gear, desolation. His own house is ablaze. There's a dead woman killed by shell fire. He made unholy sounds. Then the protagonist stood motionless, quivering lips, looking down upon the left. That's the kind of verbiage you have in a lot of his stories. It's very blunt in many ways, working the name Bierce. And there's some who think he also influenced Hemingway later on. One of the authors I read, Davidson, talked about Chickamauga. He saw it as gruesome. He had some anti-war sentiments from that. Wrote about playing soldier versus being one, and then the deaf mute again. Perhaps a metaphor for human limitations, as some people interpret it. Describes men with injuries as beetles on parade, and makes references to wars of conquest, such as the Mexican-American War. And a lot of the glory Bierce felt, told of in military books, is elusive or non-existent. In his errata or letter to Colonel Gracie about the Chickamauga book, among other things, he says, no organized troops occupied ground north of Snodgrass House. Only Granger's men moved across that area. There were no reserves, all were on firing lines. There is no hill, bald or otherwise, immediately to the north of the Snodgrass House. All is and was then open, level country for miles. So some of the topography was apparently in error. Perhaps Colonel Gracie didn't remember it properly or didn't look at Bierce's map, which of course were perfect. Bierce was also Kennesaw Mountain. I've seen it spelled two different ways, 1 and 2. This is the American Battlefield Trust map. showing the general movements. His story about this is called One of the Missing, and it involves a private Jerome Searing, who was charged to learn all he could. He was a sharpshooter. And his enemy is a Carpathian mountain-born Confederate artillery commander. Searing is dazed by a shot, covered in the building's debris, bleeding at the hand, his rifle barrel protruding. He's a veteran of Missionary Ridge and has memories of his childhood. Lieutenant Adrian Searing, a brother, and of course Ambrose Bierce did have a brother in the Civil War, commanded the pickets, and his orders were to feel out the enemy and advance until ordered to halt. Some of what he writes is in the present tense. Skirmishers sweep across plantation toward the mountain. Ray corpse was dead a week, 6 o'clock and 40 minutes. Very abrupt ending of the time of death. As I mentioned, Bierce was wounded. In June of '64, it was at Kennesaw Mountain. 2,500 Unions fell, including Bierce, wounded. And this was under General Hazen. He was shot in the head, had a complicated wound. The ball was removed sometime afterward. The temple wound, he talked about the wounded as nuisances, even though he had been one himself. His head was bound up at a field hospital. He was taken by flat car to Chattanooga, Tennessee, regaining consciousness, and the moonlight made it more painful than the wound itself, or so he claimed. He spent a month in the hospital and was furloughed to Indiana, and he broke an engagement that he had. He was captured in Alabama by their home guard, but he escaped and finally served in Franklin, Tennessee in November of '64. He recuperated in the spring of '65 in Huntsville. Bierce was also at Shiloh, and this is how the national park looks, or looked a few years ago. Some of the locales here, again, an American Battlefield Trust map, was Johnston with Beauregard in the lower left, and upper right to the north is Grant. There's Grant close up, and Johnston close up. Tennessee River is shown, and there's Shiloh Church there. That's the kind of environment he was in. I did not see any map that showed exactly where Bierce would have been. Probably some of you know. He wrote a story called What I Saw of Shiloh in 12 sections. In April of '62, the flags are flying. Nashville was lost by Kentucky and Tennessee forces. Johnston went on to Corinth, Mississippi. Grant established the Arnold Buell, reinforced it. Grant at Savannah had camps. His camps were in the hands of the CSA. Buell moved into swampy, so-called bottomlands. And he makes some references there to the Confederates being as dark and demonic, almost as if it's Dante's Inferno or something like that. He talks about the steamboats being toy-like. There were, I think, 3 of them going down the river. And the night was allies. The night helped the battle. On the beach, there was a confused mass of humanity, wounded, dead, and supposedly cowardly officers. It was rain at night, but the Union advanced, whispering commands, stumbling over the dead. Where are they? Where are the enemy? Where are my allies? And he makes comments almost the way Henry David Thoreau did in his Walden and so on, talks about the alligators there and why did the ancients worship crocodile? He has a lot of things like that. Shiloh Chapel is mentioned, and yet supposedly religious men killed each other there. There were skirmishers, no fife and drum. There was an oasis in the form of level forested areas, and of course, heavy losses. The Confederates retreated to Corinth, Mississippi. There was a lot of shell fire. And one of his lines is, "Death gleaned the field," gleaned the field of people. At 3 p.m., he talks about sleepy, cold men. A gray cloud of Confederates stormed out of the forest on bayonets. And had the numbers been different, it might have turned the tide, he points out. He refers to tents where Grant had been expelled, and the Confederates seemed to come out of nowhere. And at one point, silence. His memories are of blown bugles, blue campfire smoke, odors, new landscapes, danger, and death. The death is always there. One of his lines is, "Ah, youth, give me but one touch of thine artist hand upon the canvas of the present. Gild for but one moment the drear and somber scenes of today, and I will willingly surrender another life to the one that I should have thrown away at Shiloh." I mentioned that he had a lot of infamous sayings and definitions. In his Devil's Dictionary, a cynic is a blackguard whose faulty vision sees things as they are, not as they ought to be. A battle is a method of untying with the teeth a political knot that will yield to the tongue. History is an account mostly false of events mostly unimportant that are brought about by rulers, mostly knaves, and soldiers. Peace in international affairs, a period of cheating between two periods of fighting. Rebel, the proponent of a new misrule who has failed to establish it, a novel, a short story pattern. One of his supposed reviews of a book was, "The covers of this book are too far apart." Now we come to his latter days. I don't want to talk too much about his writing after the Civil War, because that's another subject. But as I said, he did go to Mexico. That's pretty much established. And they dramatized that in some way in Old Gringo, with Gregory Peck playing him. With journalism behind him, he was still interviewed a lot by reporters. He referred to suicide as always courageous. And there are some who think he may have committed suicide, but I think it's probably more likely he was either executed or just died in battle. In 1913, shortly before he presumably died, he did go back to the old battlefields. He went back to Shiloh, Stones River, Chickamauga, where he said, "I never amounted to much since then." Kennesaw Mountain, Franklin, and Nashville. When he went off to Mexico via New Orleans, he said, "I like the game, the fighting. I want to see it." So even after all those bitter experiences and so on, he still presumably wanted a good fight in Mexico. He retired from writing, had no family of concern, and he had some unusual relations with his family. He left manuscripts behind and books at a Laredo hotel, but no one knows exactly why. He was somehow granted credentials as an observer of Pancho Villa's army. Went horseback to Chihuahua with $1,500, which must have been quite a sum then. And Villa apparently intended to join, or he intended to join Villa's attack on the federal garrison. Late in 1913, Christmas Eve, basically, he wrote a letter to a friend, "Pray for me," real loud. In his last letter to a DC contact right after Christmas, trainload of troops leaving Chihuahua every day. Expect next day to go to Ojinaga, partly by rail. That's why a lot of people think he died there. I honestly don't remember how they showed it in the movie or Gringo. I tried to go back to that and couldn't find it, but I think they showed him kind of dying in the mist or something. So he disappeared. Many people have heard, well, he got off a stagecoach or something in Mexico and was never seen again. That's the way it's often explained. I think it's been on various mystery and unknown TV shows. One of the ranks, Ibarra, identified a photo of Bierce, but didn't know anything of his whereabouts. And some claim it was an unmarked grave. We'll talk about that in a minute. There were rumors, including that he may have made flight to England and went on to advise Kitchener on the Western Sudan front. Most likely he was shot as one of his officers, or some people think suicide. But Villa's wife could not recall her husband's mentioning Bierce, which doesn't prove much, but his name apparently didn't come up. Some people think he lay down in a pestilent hospital or crawled off to death. A couple years ago, I did something on an Illustrated London News illustrator, Frank Vizzatelli, and he also had a mysterious death. He did end up in the Sudan, I'm fairly certain. He ended up there. That's not the reason I went after Ambrose Bierce, but it was an interesting parallel. In Beverly Shaw's group, that they showed a marker, at least the one she sent to me. This one is a Mexican variety, and it basically says that he was suspected of being a spy and was shot in this place. So that's what they think there. It would be strange. He would probably stood out as being more white than other people and possibly dressing differently. But to be considered a spy would almost mean that they didn't really understand he was fighting for country. So I'd like to give some thanks to Andy Pavin, who did a summary of Chippewa, or at least some of the early parts of it, and Beverly Shaw, treasurer of the Western Missouri Roundtable, also provided some documents and photos. And of course, Rod Serling, the episode of Twilight Zone. He does say in the introduction that this is a story by Ambrose Bierce, so that's from French TV. There was another version done by an Italian director, and I think there was some others recently, some not very good. He does compare the fact that there was surprise endings, or the difference between reality and fantasy. So it's pretty well suited to Twilight Zone. Okay, well, I've gone over that somewhat fast. So if people have questions, I'll try to answer them. I do not pretend to be a full biographer of them.
Evan,
Yeah.
he was an ordinary enlisted.
Oh, he became a lieutenant. He did rise to lieutenant. He was also a topographer. Okay, so yeah, Indiana troops.
So
I have a question.
Yeah.
So what's the big mystery with the Twilight Zone? He wrote about a character who was a fictional character
Yeah.
who had hallucinations or something.
Yeah, when he's about to be hanged, the way they dramatize it and the way it's written, it looks like it's going to happen. It looks like he's having last minute thoughts. He thinks back to his wife. He thinks back to, and he thinks that he plunges into the river and gets the noose off and speeds away, shot at, but lives. And the Twilight Zone version shows things like a snake going through the water and so on. And then cuts back to him up on the platform with the noose around his neck. And that's when the hanging happens. And it's done very dramatically and abruptly.
It's weird.
Yeah,
Yeah, it is weird.
it's like all those thoughts went through his head as he was on the way down,
Right,
you know,
Right.
in that
right,
split second.
right. And the audience, of course, thinks he's really escaping.
Yeah,
They think
yeah.
it's, oh, the noose was too loose or something.
Yeah.
Other questions or comments? How about from the audience? Any questions coming from out there?
Well, just a comment, I think. A lot of times in November, and first weekend in November, I go down to Shiloh with this Shiloh discussion group. We do some pretty in-depth stuff. And 2 years ago, one of the tour leaders, one of our walks was Ambrose Bierce at Shiloh. So we essentially followed the 9th Indiana around because, I mean, you don't know exactly where Bierce was, but you know where from the signage where the 9th Indiana was. Bierce, most of his writings are fictional, but he wrote about Evan was like 5 or 6 that are, eyewitness, what he saw. And that Shiloh one, there's some darkness in that account. He writes where they come, of course, they don't, the 9th Indiana, Buell's army doesn't get there until the 7th. So they're fighting over the area they've been fought over on the day before. And they find a bunch of burned bodies from the fighting before where the woods caught on fire. And he makes this comment about these volunteers who got what they signed up for. And I've kind of struggled with that because that's dark. I mean, that's harsh, especially when you consider that he was one of those volunteers who evidently signed up for precisely that. So, he wrote this stuff later in life and he was bitter and cynical, really cynical about things. So I'm not exactly sure what he meant by that, but it's certainly a line that sticks with you when you read that. I've read all of his nonfiction Civil War accounts. I've read, I don't know, a couple of, the Owl Creek Bridge. I think a lot of us have probably read that. I read that back in high school, but a lot of his first person, or not first person, eyewitness accounts get quoted in good histories. He was there, he saw it, but there's certainly some cynicism and darkness there when you really kind of drill down into it.
Yeah, definitely. And almost everything he does, as you say, is dark and it's often ironic. And in his Devil's Dictionary, it shows a lot of these very cynical definitions of people's intentions and so on.
Yeah.
I forgot to mention that he was a printer's devil before the war.
Okay.
And so he went off supposedly to some kind of adventure, perhaps not realizing what he was in for.
I didn't know until you mentioned it in your program about his correspondence with Archibald Gracie, and which I thought was kind of interesting. Gracie was, and I'm sorry if I go off on a tangent here, but Gracie's book on Chickamauga, Gracie was not a veteran. His father, who was also named Archibald Gracie, was a Confederate brigade commander at Chickamauga, and he would not survive the war. But his son, when the park with Chickamauga, which was the first national military park, when it was open and the signs, the interpretive signs started going up and everything, he didn't agree with how the park interpreted the latter part of the battle, like the Horseshoe Ridge, the final part of the fighting. So he wrote this book to try to offer an alternative view of how he thought things really happened. And his conclusions are, well, they're all wet. I mean, he's got troops in the wrong places and he's not he's not correct, but the value of his book is that he corresponded with a lot of Union veterans, and all that stuff that he corresponded, it's all in that book. So it's a great source of material. And he was apparently going to write a Confederate volume, because the truth about Chickamauga is all Union accounts. And he was going to write a Confederate volume, but writing the first book wore him out. And he published this, he published it, I think, in 1911 or 1912. And he takes a short vacation to Europe. And then on the way back, he decides to book passage on a brand new ship called the Titanic. And so, and Gracie does survive. He ends up in a lifeboat, but he's like 60 years old, and spending all those hours in the cold and being wet and everything ruined his health. But he did write a book about the Titanic, which apparently is still in print. I've never read it, but he died, I think, by the end of 1912. So all the Confederate correspondence that he apparently had never got published, and nobody knows whatever happened to it. But anyway, that's way off topic, but you know how I am. I'll, give me an inch, I'll take a mile. But Evan, you may be muted. I'm not hearing you. Nope, you're quiet.
Oh, I had a, I had a question. You say he wasn't especially anti-war. Was he opposed to the gore, the fighting, and everything? Some of his work seemed like it's anti-war. I was thinking some of his works sound a little bit like the end of the war on the Western Front, the World War One book, which was, I think, anti-war in character. That was by it looks like Arian Murray Remarque. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right. He was the one that was the author of the end of the war on the Western Front. All's quiet on the Western Front. Excuse me. All's quiet on the Western Front.
Evan, I can hear Mike. I'm not hearing you at all. So I don't know if you're muted or we've lost sound somewhere.
It looks like he's muted.
He may be. I can hear Mike just fine, but I can't hear Evan at all. And maybe they can't hear Mike. Maybe they can't hear us either. I don't know.
Okay,
Not sure.
okay.
There he is.
There he is.
Okay, I think I'm echoing. He was anti-war. But definitely not in favor.
I think we've lost Evan again as far as sound.
I noticed quite an echo there.
Yeah.
Now, do you still hear us?
Echo.
Yeah, we're hearing a lot of echo, but there wasn't any echo earlier, but there is now.
Can you hear Stacy?
Second.
Not hearing anything now.
Hello? Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Can anybody in Zoom hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
I can hear you. It's fine. No echo either.
Perfect.
Okay,
Hang on, let me try to unmute and maybe you can get me. Can you hear on my microphone?
I can hear you, Stacy, but you got a lot of echo.
Yeah.
Now, just a minute ago when Evan was talking, there was no echo at all.
I don't know what happened in the meantime. I touched nothing.
Can you hear me? No. Echo.
Huh.
With the echo, Evan, you kind of sounded like an Ambrose Bierce fictional writing there. Kind of spooky. Well, he did have that, he was shot in the head, so a traumatic brain injury. I mean, that could have something to do with his attitude, thoughts as he got older. I mean, we hear so much about traumatic brain injuries, and even though I think the ball didn't go into his brain, that's a pretty serious concussion.
Hello? Right, well, still echoing. Ambrose Bierce. I think that's all for tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. While we're at it, Beverly Shaw, who is a lady